First guy to say that if a government does not have any revenues, then it ceases to exist, right? It becomes bankrupt. So I have said many times before, this notion of zero tax and all that is just a kind of ill-informed notion. The government has to raise money in some way, otherwise the government doesn't have any money to spend. In fact, one of the important functions of government is redistribution, taking from those who can afford to pay and covering those who are too poor, too weak, too sick, providing social security benefits or health care, or giving equal access, providing quality education to those who cannot pay their own fees. So, in fact, if you look around the world, those parts of the world that have very high quality of life indices, like Scandinavia, like Australia, like some parts of Western Europe, you will find that the government's revenues as a percentage of the GDP or the GSDP, that is, the size of the government's role in the economy, will be 25, 30, 35%. Why is that? Because they provide comprehensive benefits for everybody, not just education, not just healthcare, housing, maternity leave, paternity leave. They provide every kind of value add to a life that makes sure that the lowest level of the pyramid is already living a good life. That is not it's not a random correlation. It is a clear logic that the government chooses to have that kind of role. Now, if you go to a country like the United States, where at least in its own nature it's capitalistic, then it doesn't intend to do that much, because there's always this risk that government becomes inefficient or corrupt, or it spends money to perpetuate itself. So there's the whole kind of economic right-wing philosophy of small government, and you cut back. But even in a country like the United States, it's not uncommon for it to be 20 to 25%, the size of the budget, the government's revenues relative to the overall economy. And during the pandemic, it becomes much higher, right? They put in 10% of the GDP, $1 trillion as a stimulus, twice. So the real issue is every government needs money, every government spends money. What is the philosophy that drives how you raise the money, what kind of taxation, from what kind of people, at what kind of rate, and then how do you spend the money? I don't want to talk about too many other people or parties, but I will draw the clear distinction between the union government of the last 7 years and at least the Admk government of the last year. To some extent, I'll attribute that to all Dravidian parties, in fact, to all parties that have ever run governments in Tamil Nadu or Madras state or Madras presidency. We are inclusive kind of social justice, economic opportunity, lower the Gini coefficient, provide education and upliftment opportunities for all kind of government. We are more so than certainly our predecessors, but all Tamil Nadu governments have been that way. If you look back at the BJP government's track record of the last 7 years, that is clearly not so. The poor and the weak have suffered substantially. The amount of joblessness has increased a lot. The share of the economy owned by the top 5 people and then the top 0.01% of the population has grown exponentially. And this is the exact opposite philosophy to the philosophy that the DMK party and the government of our Chief Minister Stalin advocates. If you look at the union government between 2014 and today, the share of total revenues that comes from direct taxes has dropped from 52, 53, 55% down to as low as 44, 45, 43%. Now they're trying to correct it. If you look at the projections in the medium-term fiscal plan presented by the Union Finance Minister in February, they're trying to go back towards a more balanced ratio. In fact, the ratio shouldn't be balanced at all. For economic justice, the OECD's guideline is 60% direct tax, 40% indirect tax. Because direct tax is inherently progressive. Once I know who I am taking it from, direct, near muha, I know your economic circumstances, I know what you can afford to pay, and I tax you according to your ability to pay. So for those who are really wealthy, not just do I collect more in quantity, but at a higher rate. The tax slab keeps increasing. Indirect taxes are not knowing who is actually doing the buying, we collected at the point of sale as a classic example. So GST is a classic example. Petrol, diesel tax is a classic example. Most of the time the government knows the seller. If there is a GST party on the buyer side, the government knows the buyer, but in most cases the government doesn't know. Certainly the government doesn't know how much petrol or diesel each of us consume. So the problem with indirect taxes is that since you cannot set the taxation policy based on the ability to pay or the ability to spend or the economic circumstances, it is inherently regressive. What does regressive mean? It means that if you're a factory worker making 30 or 40,000 rupees a month, the proportion of your salary, your income that you spend on taxable goods and services, and therefore the effective tax rate for GST or other sales taxes is going to be much higher than, let's say, a managing director at a bank that makes 10 or 15 crores a year. Because surely their petrol consumption doesn't go up 100 times or 1,000 times compared to a person who's only making 50,000 rupees, right? So the richer a person is, the more likely they're going to save, to invest, to do spending not related to taxation on consumption, which is what GST is. It's taxation on consumption. So indirect taxes are inherently regressive, and it's black and white that under this government in Delhi, the proportion of total revenue coming from indirect tax has greatly increased by lakhs of crores a year in actual quantitative terms. In percentage terms, I say up to 10%. I won't say the bulk, but a substantial portion of this indirect tax increase has come in taxation on energy products, in particular petrol, diesel, sold at the pump. So if we just put this in perspective, when the UPA government